Ms. Trethaway just stood up here and said that if Chloe believed her actions were right, then she would be justified. That's not the law. And she's conflating the two different ways to prove insanity. Her ability to distinguish between right from wrong and delusional compulsion. The two don't overlap. Those are two different ways to prove insanity. If she just said to you, if Chloe believed in her mind she was justified, then she's insane. That's not the law either. And you don't have to believe me. The judge will tell you. The delusion, if true, would have legally justified the act. If we assume what was in her mind, it is legally justifiable under Georgia's self-defense laws. That's the law. It doesn't matter what Chloe thought was justified. The only thing that matters with regard to her distinction between wrong and right is the other part of the insanity charge, whether she had the ability to distinguish between right and wrong. When we're talking about whether the delusion was as to a fact, if true, would justify the act, we're talking about legal justification under the laws of Georgia, not about what Chloe Driver thinks about it. It's also important to me to address the fact that Ms. Trethaway indicated the state wants you to ignore all this stuff about her mental state. They just put up all this gory evidence to play on your emotions, even though Ms. Driver has never disputed the fact that she committed these acts. Except she has. She pled not guilty. We have the burden of proving the murder. I have to. It is my job. I'm not going to phone it in when we have a murder of a 13-month-old child just because I know her defense is insanity. I still, under the law, I have the burden of proving the murder. And I'm going to put up every ounce of evidence that I need to put up in order to do that. And that is not to play on your emotions. The fact that it was emotional, and the fact that it's horrific, and the fact that that body cam is going to haunt all of our dreams for a very long time is because of the actions of Chloe Driver, not because I'm trying to manipulate you. The state has a duty, and our duty is to represent Hannah. She was murdered in Cherokee County, and we have to prove her guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And my presentation of evidence to you in that regard was following my oath. It was not to manipulate you or to convince you to ignore anything. I don't want you to ignore any evidence that came before you. Ms. Trethaway said, well, the state could have gotten another evaluation if they wanted to. None of the evaluations that have come before you meet the definition of legal insanity. Why would we keep asking for evaluations? It's their burden to prove insanity, and they haven't done it. Because none of the evaluations demonstrate that she doesn't understand the difference between right and wrong, or that she had any specific delusions that, if true, would justify the act, if true, would allow her to defend herself against Hannah. She could be evaluated by 10 more doctors. There's no evidence in this case that she meets the definition of legal insanity. And the state has never tried to pull the wool over your eyes, or ask you to ignore evidence, or ask you to be distracted. We have just asked you to focus on the actual issues in this case. And the fact of the matter is, it is their burden to prove insanity. It is not our burden. She is presumed sane under the law. It is our burden to prove the murder. It is their burden to prove insanity. I want to talk to you about some of the evidence that came before you. And one of the things that we need to talk about is Jason Spillers. I know everybody in the free world was questioning the wisdom of my decision to put this man on the witness stand and let him ramble on incessantly. I promise you it was not because I am a pea-brained female who is not capable of intelligent thought like Mr. Spillers would like you to believe. He provided some very valuable information, and he provided context to some things that you needed to have. There were statements made by Chloe Driver in this case about his new friends in the group, about her new existence, about how things had changed when he had gotten these new followers. Who do you think she's talking about? Old Crazy Pants. And he took this witness stand and talked about drinking his own pee, talking about all of his crazy views about women and their inferiority and how they're not capable of intelligent thought. And most of what he had to say was complete garbage. And I expect that most of what he had to say, you all will probably completely disregard. But what became very clear is that him and Benjamin had this little intellectual bromance. And they probably sat around and acted like they were the two smartest men who ever lived on the face of the planet. And things got different for Chloe and Hannah and the other women because Benjamin was in this little romance with his smart buddy, Jason Spillers, and the women were supposed to giggle and play and go do the things that women do because they're not smart enough to participate in intelligent thought. And so things got different for Chloe Driver, and she didn't like it. Those were her statements. You seeing it with your own two eyes, what her existence was, her wanting to get far away from Jason Spillers is not insane. That's reasonable because everybody in this courtroom felt the same way. They did not want to be around him because he was difficult to be around. And so he needed to come before you. You needed to see that with your own two eyes because it provides context to her statements about why she did what she did and why she was feeling the way she felt. And what were those statements? We knew that Jason Spillers was new to this group and that he had met Z in April of 2020. Chloe's been in the picture for 3 years, and it was just the last couple of months when things really went to go sideways. And it was after he joined the group. This is telling. He started spending a lot of time with them around July of 2020, and it definitely provided context for her statements to the detective. The first thing she wrote about why she did it, he didn't do it, I did it. I was going insane. I no longer wanted to be with his friends, but kept coming back for him. I only wanted my baby and husband, but he refused. When she said, I no longer wanted to be with his friends, she's talking about Jason Spillers. And you needed to see it. You needed to see it because her reasons and her motivation behind committing this act wasn't her delusions, it was her reality. It was the day-to-day life that she was subjected to, having to be around these two men. Her motivation was her reality, not her delusion. And you saw it. She told us why. When I stood up here in my opening statements, I said, pay attention to the why. It will help you solve the legal equation. It will help you put the pieces together. Why did she commit this act? This is when she was writing to Benjamin. No, I went to get a knife. I couldn't handle being with the group anymore, and you left me no alternative with certain threats of taking the money and not letting me just buy land and be with her as long as I needed. You had the whole group to take care of and blamed me for all the problems. These were her statements to Benjamin. She was fed up. She didn't want to be with this group. She didn't want to be with his friends. She wanted a normal life for her baby. She did not want him to keep recruiting more wives and more people to have to take care of and divide the attention even more. These were her statements. I just wanted to have a normal life for Nimsy. These were the very first statements that she was making to the people she cares about, her mom, Benjamin, and to the detectives in the case about why she committed the act. None of this is delusional. It is all very, very rooted in her reality, which was a living hell. These are her notes to the doctor that evaluated her shortly after she was hospitalized. I was stating for months I couldn't handle my husband's lifestyle anymore. She didn't want to be around all these people. He collects people to live with us, and after we got 3 more people, Sarah, Jessica, Jason, I started perceiving them as ganging up on me and leaving me out and changing stories. She's referencing the existence that was her reality. She is not referencing delusions. And you saw 4 hours from Jason Spillers, which was a little glimpse of what every day of her life must have been like. For the first 2 years, not so much because it was just us traveling, but once he got people listening to him more, I started feeling scared and was begging for attention for us to be with the baby. These were the things that she wrote about why she committed these acts. They're not delusional. They're reasonable. Because wanting a husband and a child and not being in a cult, that's not unreasonable. That's not irrational. It's not delusional. That is a reasonable thought process. It was just the realities of her situation that she chose to commit the act she did because she could not deal with the reality of the situation that she chose to put herself in. The doctor who evaluated her in the hospital, patient felt the only way out was to kill her daughter and herself. He did not notate that she killed her daughter because of any delusions. He notated that her motivation for committing the act was because her and her daughter, it was the only way for them to get out. And that is not a delusion. And that is certainly not a delusion that, if true, would justify the act under the self-defense laws. This is not criminal insanity. This is her making a decision out of desperation because of the situation that was her reality. She told us why she did it. November the 25th of 2020, she Googled killing someone to save them. This is consistent with what all the doctors said about what she said about her feelings about Hannah. The last doctor, Dr. Zom, said that essentially the overarching theme of things, whether they were rooted in her religious beliefs or rooted in her delusions, the overarching theme was, saving her daughter from a life of suffering. And that's consistent with what we know she Googled on November the 25th. And that is not a delusion that, if true, would justify the act. It is not insanity under the law. She was not motivated by her delusions or her insanity. She was motivated by her reality. And I think what kind of highlights that is, ironically, the testimony of Gabriella Kuykendall, Benjamin's ex-wife. She said it was difficult to leave. She said she doesn't have mental health problems and she thought about killing herself. It was a difficult existence that they found themselves in. And she wasn't delusional at all. She thought about just ending it. Not because of delusions, but because of reality. Because of the circumstances that they experienced. I want to talk to you about the evidence that demonstrates that she understood the ability to distinguish between right and wrong. Dr. Ballard indicated, when asked if she thought her behavior was wrong, Chloe Driver expressly said, "Yeah, as soon as it happened, I regretted it. I thought I shouldn't have done this. This was not supposed to happen." Dr. Garrett, she recalled apologizing to Hannah and told her daughter how much she loved her. "I knew this was wrong from the beginning." These are the statements that she made from her own mouth to these doctors. And Dr. Zom, who testified last, said, "That's not inconsistent with my assessment of the situation." You saw one of the first things that she wrote was, "How long is my prison sentence going to be for killing her?" It was very, very clear that she appreciated the consequences of her actions. She understood the wrongfulness of it, but she still did it. This was not an inability to distinguish between right and wrong. She chose to kill Hannah knowing it was wrong. And she said that out of her own mouth. Now, when we talk about the delusional compulsion, I gave you the law, and I want to just refresh your memory on it one more time because it was misstated by Ms. Trethaway. The defendant has to be laboring under the delusion at the time of the commission of the act. The criminal act itself has to be connected with the particular delusion, and it has to be as to a fact that, if true, would justify the act under Georgia self-defense laws. And we talked about that. In order to justify the act, she would have to believe that force, that killing her, was necessary to prevent serious bodily injury or death to herself, or to prevent Hannah from committing a forcible felony. There's zero evidence of that. There is no evidence and no possible way that this third rung of the delusional compulsion insanity defense can be met. Dr. Garrett, when she testified, she indicated she did not ask Chloe any questions about the cult dynamics or the conflict in the cult, despite the notes that Chloe wrote in the hospital, the ones that we just talked about, the ones that sort of demonstrated what her motivation for committing the act was. The doctor did not ask her about the dynamics of the group. did not ask her about the cult culture. She also did not ask her any details about the crime itself. She didn't give any details about what she was doing in that room, what the play-by-play was. If your inquiry is what was her state of mind at the time she committed the act, then the circumstances surrounding the act are really important. And Dr. Garrett instead said she didn't find it to be particularly relevant. She said, I asked her what she was thinking and how she was feeling. Except for Dr. Garrett is not her therapist. This is a question of legal insanity. It is a question of law. And Ms. Trethewey indicated that Dr. Garrett is the state's expert. Dr. Garrett works for a state agency in the same way that, like, a teacher might be a state employee. She's not the state's expert. We didn't hire her. We didn't retain her. The facts that came before you is I sent her a referral form after there was a court order for her to complete an assessment. Dr. Roberta Ballard is a private doctor that was hired by the defense. Then the state agency did an evaluation of her. Then an independent expert did an evaluation of her. That is all very common procedure in criminal cases. So when she says this is the state's expert, it is the state's expert in the context of she works for a state agency, but not the state of Georgia that is prosecuting this case. She is not affiliated with us. I want to talk to you about, I completed this chart with her on the stand. And I said, tell me what the delusions were. Give them to me. What did she say were the delusions? Because this jury is going to have to make decisions about what the particular delusion was that she was laboring under, whether it was connected to the act, and whether that delusion, if true, justified the act. That's your legal equation. And so we went through these. And so she indicated the particular delusions connected with the act of murdering Hannah was that everything was telling her to do it. People talking about death, thinking she should do it. Seeing knives. So let's play that out for a minute. Here's a knife. I see it. We're going to assume that everything in my head is true. And my head is telling me that everybody in this jury box is telling me to take this knife and go stab Mr. Focus. So if we assume that's true, that all 14 of you, 15 of you, are telling me, Katie, take that knife and go stab him. Do it. Take the knife. Go stab him. Would I be legally justified in doing that? No. Absolutely not. Just because the whole world and the whole room wants me to kill him, it doesn't mean I'm legally justified in doing it. And that's what I mean when I say that if we assume it's true, it has to justify the act. And that's why it's really a narrow category, very narrow category of cases where the person that gets killed or harmed is perceived in their mind to be an immediate threat to them. Hannah would have to be an immediate threat to her. If Mr. Fogus, if I looked at him and I was having a distorted thinking or a delusional thought and I thought he was about to hurt me, and we assume that my delusional thinking is true, then maybe I'd be justified in defending myself and hurting him back. But that is not the evidence in this case. And none of these delusions, which ones, if true, would justify the act? And the answer is 0. There are none. Absolutely not a shred of evidence that she ever thought Hannah was a harm to her or anybody else. Dr. Ballard, when she was asked about things that Chloe Driver actually said close in time to the crime, which is the handwritten notes, I asked her about Mr. Focus asked her about the handwritten notes. She indicated that it's misguided to assume that anything she said a day later is controlling. But the fact of the matter is, the question, the legal question, is what her state of mind was at the time she committed the offense. Lots of people gain insight into their behavior and their actions and the things that they did as time goes on. But the pertinent question for you is, what was her state of mind in the moment that she committed the offense? So in that regard, don't you think that her statements close in time, her condition close in time, her mental state close in time is the most relevant? And she just disregarded it. The question is, what was her mental state at the time of the crime? I really do not want to revisit all of these body cameras gratuitously, but she is making statements and I need you to hear them. She has presence of mind. She understands the situation. She says repeatedly, let him be with her.
Please let him be with her. Please let him be with her. Please let him.
Just get there 39, brother.
Please let him be with her.
Just get there 39. Come on.
Please.
Take him. Come on, go downstairs. Come on. We gotta
Tell you that quick now. Come on, quick.
She's not delusional. She's oriented. She knows exactly what's happening. She wants the baby's dad to be able to be with her when she dies. She understands the severity of the situation. She is mentally there. The EMT calls Hannah a boy, and she corrects him, her.
Where's he at? That's this girl.
She says it's a he, and Chloe says it's a girl. She has a severe presence of mind. She knows exactly what is happening in that room. She says, is that it? That's goodbye?
Is that it? Be with her.
She understands the consequence of her decision to stab that baby. She understands that her death is impending, and she understands the wrongness of her actions. And she shows us that in the minutes after she committed the act. She asks whether Hannah's still alive. She is not delusional or unclear about what she just did or why she did it. She has presence of mind. She understands the consequences. She understands the permanency, and she understands the result. Dr. Ballard focused primarily on Chloe Driver being a victim of coercive control. There was a lot of testimony about her being a domestic violence victim. And one of the things that Ms. Trethaway said that maybe just landed a little wrong for me is that, everybody at this table, this goes against everything that they've ever been trained to believe about domestic violence victims. And the thing is, I've been a prosecutor for 17 years. And I've done nothing but crimes against women and children my entire career. And I've encountered a lot of domestic violence victims. And I've never stood up here and told you that Chloe Driver didn't experience domestic violence. I have never said that. And I'm not going to say that. What I have said is that Chloe Driver didn't experience any domestic violence in Cherokee County. So we have nothing to prosecute. We have jurisdiction over the crimes that were committed in Cherokee County, which was the murder of Hannah Driver. And the other thing I know about domestic violence victims is they don't get a free pass under the law to murder their children. No matter how bad their situation is, the law still has to apply to them. Just because they have experienced something terrible in their life does not give them the right to murder innocent, defenseless little children. And that is not because we don't care about domestic violence victims. It's because the matter before us and the crime committed in Cherokee County and the relevant issues in this case are not domestic violence. They're murder of a child. It is clear that some of these experts and the defense really don't place any responsibility on Ms. Driver at all for any of her actions. And it's something I ask you to consider and think about in the context of a cult. Because in theory, if there is one cult leader and then there are all these cult followers, are we to believe that any criminal actions by anybody who joins this cult, they are no longer responsible for it? They don't have to answer for their choices and their decisions because there's one person that's manipulative and controlling at the top. So now all of a sudden everybody has absolved themselves of criminal responsibility and free will. but that is not the law. You cannot join a cult or an oppressive situation or be in an abusive relationship and now the law no longer apply to you. You still have to answer for your decisions. You still have to suffer consequences of your criminal actions. The judge is going to tell you that the evidence that came before you about the abuse of Chloe Driver by Benjamin is really only relevant to for a very narrow reason. And the state was not trying to ask you to ignore anything or distract you or have you look away from things. It's just really not the question before you, whether or not she was abused. The judge is going to tell you that the only relevant purpose for that testimony is whether or not it sheds light on her mental state. That is relevant to her insanity defense. So to the extent that her abusive, controlling, oppressive situation, we've never said she didn't experience those things. She probably did. It's just not really the issue before you to diagnose or decide. But to what extent do those things have an impact on her mental state? And what I want to tell you is the defense expert kept using the term coercive control. And the truth is, coercion is not a defense to murder under the laws of the state of Georgia. So the only thing you're concerning yourself with in this case is whether or not she meets the definition of insanity under the law. And even if you take these abusive events and you think about, how they might have impacted her mental state, you still have to determine whether she meets the definition of insanity. You still got to go back to those two tests. Could she distinguish right from wrong? And was she suffering under the compulsion of delusion that, if true, would justify the act? So even assuming that you believe she was this oppressed victim of domestic violence by Benjamin and you believe all the stuff about what her treatment was probably like, she still, in order for it to be a defense, has to meet the definition of insanity under the law. So you have to put that evidence about her treatment by Benjamin into the proper context. And the judge will tell you the only context that it is relevant to in this particular case in terms of solving the legal question before you is to what extent you think that impacted her ability to distinguish from right from wrong, and to what extent that impacted her delusions that were connected to the act that, if true, would justify the act. And once you kind of do the math and do the equation, you will arrive at the conclusion that none of the delusions would justify the act legally, and that she clearly understood the permanency of her decision and the consequences of her actions. Dr. Ballard also did talk a little bit about her diagnostic testing, and I think this is important to discuss. Ms. Driver had an invalid score on her assessment, and she over-endorsed and over-reported symptoms. And so there was questioning by Mr. Fogus about that, because that's obviously concerning in the context of a forensic evaluation when the test scores essentially show that she's exaggerating. And it showed that she had very high scores and that she had a motivated response. But when asked about it, the doctor basically indicated, well, it could mean that, she's trying to get herself out of trouble, but I just interpreted it as a cry for help. She chose instead to interpret it as she's just piling on all these extra symptoms and exaggerating her symptoms because she's desperate for help. But the fact of the matter is she's already in the jail, she's already receiving mental health help, she's already medicated, she's already away from him even though she's continuing to reach out to him and call him. So why did this expert choose to discount the possibility that Ms. Driver was potentially exaggerating her symptoms to benefit herself in a criminal case and instead just chose to call this a cry for help? It's something to consider with regard to Ms. Driver, because we know some things about her. She's not dumb. She has above average intelligence according to the last expert. She manipulated the doctors and the jail staff in order to get access to an unrecorded office line where she was supposed to speak to only her lawyer and her mother when she is in jail for murder. And she uses this unrecorded office line and abuses those privileges to continue to call him. Of course, once it's detected by us, they immediately revoke her privileges and put an end to it. But then what does she do? She continues to communicate with him after his number has been blocked by the jail, and intentionally does not share that information with the doctors that are evaluating her because it doesn't fit into the narrative that she's desperately trying to escape him and she's being held against her will. The state has never said she wasn't a domestic violence victim, but this narrative that she was held against her will and she couldn't leave and she had no access to money and he would take her phone, it's not true. Maybe he was controlling her mind, but the undisputed evidence is she had a phone in her bag, she had $1,000 in her bag, she had spent 2 days at her parents' house just days before she murdered her daughter. She didn't say anything to her parents about wanting to go get mental health help or thinking about killing her baby. Miss Trethewey stood up here and said, well, all these people could have done something to prevent it. If Jason and Benjamin and Sarah and Jessica would have just gotten her help. But she was at her parents' house for 2 days, right before this happened. That video on November the 27th when she said, he has my baby against my will, she went to her parents' house after that. That's what the evidence was. And she said, Miss Trethewey stood up here in front of you and said, she was not going to leave him without her baby. She had to go back to him. She was not going to leave him without her baby. The evidence is she was not going to leave him, period. Because her baby was dead. She murdered her baby. And then she continued to communicate with him for over 2 years. Murdering Hannah in her rational, medicated, stable state, understanding she murdered her own child, she continued to reach out to him and call him over 600 times. This wasn't about Hannah. Hannah could not be held over her head. Hannah could not be stolen away by Benjamin. Hannah was gone. Hannah was dead. And she still made that choice. And the thing is, there are consequences for choices. If you want to get away from somebody, there's no better place than the county jail. Because he can't get in and he can't call you. But she found ways to get to him. She convinced 6 other inmates to use their phone pins for over 2 years so she could continue to contact him and had 617 calls. All of this was while she was medicated and stable and not delusional. She learned from the best in terms of her ability to manipulate the process, manipulate the system. The evidence in this case is that these groups were fraudsters by trade. They had plans to go steal houses that were bank-owned on Zillow. They had taken out all these COVID loans. They didn't have any insurance. They had all this trust documentation. They found out ways to get free cars. They had tons of money. None of these people had jobs, and they had a ton of money in the bank. Because they would just lie, cheat, and steal from the government in a way that benefited them. And the questioning of Dr. Zom at the end was, oh yeah, she understood. She knew the inner workings of how to game the system. She was very, very educated and knowledgeable about it. She told Dr. Zom she was 80 pounds when she entered the hospital, which was a under-report of 33 pounds from what her actual weight was. And maybe that's not a significant fact to you, but it's just a fact that's not true. It's just something that's not supported by objective, independent evidence. And so it's something to pay attention to. What is her motive in this case? How is she attempting to paint herself despite her intentional, repetitive conduct to the contrary? She had a conversation with her father just prior to being evaluated by Dr. Zom, where they discussed that she would be screwing herself if she acted normal in that evaluation. Those are things for y'all to consider. What she has to gain or lose in this case. What she might have to gain from over-exaggerating her symptoms. And why her statements at the hospital, when she was at her lowest, and she was sad, and she was raw, and she's just telling it, why those statements are really the more credible statements about what motivated her act. What did every expert agree on? Every single one. Dr. Zom, Dr. Ballard, Dr. Garrett, they all said she never believed Hannah was a threat to her or anyone else. And because of that, the third prong of that delusional compulsion insanity defense cannot and will not be met. So why did she do it? I've thought a lot about that, and I'm sure you have too. What was the prevailing emotion when she gave in and decided she was going to end it for both of them? Was it desperation? Was it anger at her situation? Was it a mercy killing? Was she saving Hannah? Did she just feel hopeless? Was she mentally ill? It's not the insanity defense. If this is what you think any of her motivation was in committing the act, none of those are insanity under the law. Because no matter how hopeless you feel, no matter how desperate you feel, no matter how angry you feel, no matter how frustrated you feel, you don't get to commit the act of murder. And that is the law. What does the evidence actually show in this case? This was not a fleeting moment of insanity. It wasn't. The evidence shows that she thought about it, and she planned it. She had searched how to snap a neck. She had searched killing someone to save them. And you'll have her searches back there, and you can go through them, and you see the progression, because on about November 22nd and 23rd, she starts questioning the ideologies of the group. Am I sinning? Like, should I be with this man that has multiple wives? She's starting to question her reality. She's not questioning her delusions, she's questioning her reality. And then she starts to wonder about what the consequences of those certain things are. None of those are delusional. And then she starts to plan her exit strategy. And the evidence is she was weighing her options. She was Googling, and you can look at her phone and see, she was Googling travel plans. She was Googling bus tickets. How to get a bus ticket for a 13-month-old. Woman traveling alone with baby. She was evaluating the other options. She was thinking about leaving. She was desperately tied to him and loved him. And as I said in my opening statement, she could not decide if she wanted to stay or go, so she picked a different option. And that is what the evidence shows. She was so desperate to not know which one she wanted that she just decided to end it for both of them, except for she was unsuccessful for herself. She was at her parents' house for days between when she Googled those thoughts of wanting to kill Hannah and when she actually killed Hannah. That's what the evidence is. So she wasn't deprived of the ability to get the help she wanted. She just wasn't ready to give him up. Her mom said she stayed for a couple of days and then she went to look at some property with him in Knoxville. And we know she wasn't ready to give him up because she stuck it out with him for years, even after she killed Hannah. If killing your own child doesn't wake you up, what does? She made those choices. She was not a captive. She had the ability to go. She had the ability to call 911. She had the ability to access money. That's what the evidence has been before you. She chose not to. This is ultimately what the evidence in this case shows. She was not motivated by her delusions, her insanity, or her mental illness. What she was motivated by was her reality. And it was a reality that she chose over and over and over again. I'm asking you to hold her accountable for what she did to Hannah. Because while there may be some evidence that she's suffered a difficult life or that she's experienced certain things, that does not give her the right to take away the life of a 13-month-old child. That does not give her the right to stab that baby girl who did nothing to her repeatedly. There were so many other choices. So many other choices. And she chose that. There have to be consequences under the law for killing defenseless, innocent children. And when you apply the law, when you do the legal formula, when you look at the insanity laws, you will clearly see she does not meet them. And that the only true verdict in this case is one that holds her responsible for her actions, just as anybody else who committed an act like this would be, to find her guilty. This is the last place that Hannah experienced life. She stabbed this baby girl to death until what the ER doctor said, she was empty. She had no blood left. That was a violent, heinous, horrible way to die. And I don't care how bad your life is, you do not get to do that to this baby girl. And there be no consequences for you. She chose that life, Hannah did not. Hold her responsible. Apply the law. Apply the law in a reasoned way that doesn't play into sympathy, that is objective, that speaks to justice. That is your duty. And when you apply the law and you objectively evaluate the facts in this case, the only conclusion that you can reach is her guilt.
Thank you. Members of the jury, then the next phase of the trial will be that I will instruct